Good morning, Barry Bryson here. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes. We're talking about Paul's co-workers and their biographies as we can reconstruct them from the book of Acts and from Paul's letters. So we want to talk today about Barnabas. We started yesterday, introduced him as a man the apostles had so much confidence in, a man who we saw on the mission field be positive and encouraging and really fulfilling his name, the guy who builds other people up. We saw him go and fetch Paul, who's still being called Saul, himself from his hometown, and bring him into the work and spend a year training him up. And so today in Acts chapter 13, and this happens after the event where Peter is sprung from prison in Acts chapter 12 and ends up at Barnabas' sister's house. In Acts chapter 13, we go back to Barnabas and the work at Antioch and how successful it was. The Antioch church was probably the biggest congregation in the first century, just from the way it is described. And it was a multicultural congregation, a diverse congregation. And we'll see how diverse it is today, because in Acts chapter 13, the ministers there are told that 2 of their number are being sent into the mission field. And the person who tells them this is the Lord himself, the Spirit. So we're in Acts chapter 13, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 3. Now there were at Antioch, in the church that was there, prophets and teachers. Barnabas, who we know was a Levite from Cyprus. Simeon, who was called Niger, he was called Black. He was called he was called that for one reason or another. We're not sure. Lucius of Cyrene, that's in North Africa. Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. So we have a Levite, one guy at least from North Africa. Manaen, a guy who was brought up at the highest levels, who had been a mover and a shaker, someone who was among the elite, and then Saul, this guy from Tarsus who was a Roman citizen, this guy who was perhaps the most broadly educated man, one of them of his age, and who had received the best rabbinic training and had been a persecutor of the church. It's quite a diverse group of men. While they were ministering to the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." And when they had fasted and prayed, they laid their hands on them and sent them away. And thus Paul, Saul, and Barnabas go on the first missionary journey. And the first place they go, and the Holy Spirit sends them, verse 4, is Seleucia and then to Cyprus. So Antioch is on the southern coast of Turkey, not too far from the Lebanese border, the Antioch where they are. And so they're going to the island of Cyprus, and they're going to come back north on this first missionary journey to Turkey and minister to the coast, and then go somewhat into the interior of what is present-day Turkey. It's not that long of a missionary journey, and they don't cover as many miles as Paul will on subsequent missionary journeys, but it is their first missionary journey together. And the first place they go is his home island of Cyprus, and they have quite an eventful time of it. Paul delivers a sermon that sounds very much like Stephen's sermon there when they're at Pisidian Antioch on the Sabbath day. They end up, when they go to Turkey, going to Lystra and Derbe, and there people take them to be Greek gods visiting the earth, and they think that Barnabas is Zeus and Lystra is Hermes. There in chapter 14, verse 14, Barnabas is called an apostle, which is interesting. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard it, they tore their robes and rushed out into the crowd crying, "Men, why are you doing these things?" People were trying to worship them at Lystra and Derbe. and they are described as apostles. Now, the word apostle means one who is sent on a mission. The original word described basically cargo ships, but it came to mean someone who was a special envoy, someone who was sent somewhere with a specific purpose. And I don't know that we will number Barnabas among the apostles, the group of apostles that included the 12 Jesus called and then subsequently included Paul. But he was an apostle in the sense that, and equally an apostle with Paul on this journey, in the sense that they were singled out by the Holy Spirit with a mission. What happens at Antioch, at Lystra and Derbe, it's interesting because the people go from worshiping them to despising them when they refuse that worship, and then they stone Paul and they leave him for dead. And the thing that Paul does at the end of chapter 14, after he's left for dead outside the city, is he's revived. He gets up and he goes right back in the city. And then he and Barnabas go back to the congregations that they had established on their first missionary journey. They, on this second leg of their trip, establish elders in each city, and then they go back to Antioch, and they spend a long time there at Antioch. So there's some time between the events of their first missionary journey, which finishes up at the end of chapter 14, and what happens in chapter 15. And what happens in chapter 15 is that there are folks that come around and who start teaching that it's not enough to be a Gentile. You have to be a Jew as well. You have to be circumcised. You have to observe the law of Moses. If you have to become a proselyte to Judaism before you can become a Christian. And this is detailed at the beginning of chapter 15. Some men came down from Judea and began teaching the brethren. One assumes we're talking about Antioch because Antioch has just been talked about. That's where they are, where we've left Paul and Barnabas. Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. When Paul and Barnabas had great when Paul and Barnabas had great dissension and debate with them, the brethren determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders concerning the issue. And so they do. They do. They sent them there, and they had a conference in Jerusalem with the elders and with the apostles. It's interesting, the person who is the spokesman at this event is James. James, not the apostle, but James, the brother of Jesus, who wrote the book of James, who evidently was one of the elders that was mentioned as being the apostles and the elders. And it's interesting to me that the elders have the final say on this issue. Peter gets up. Paul and Barnabas get up and talk about their missionary journey. Peter gets up and speaks on the side of Paul and Barnabas and says, listen, I was the first person to share the gospel with a Gentile, and God doesn't expect them to be Jews first. And so the decision is made, that Gentiles do not have to become Jews in order to be Christians. Now, the question will continue to be discussed. Does a Jew have to continue to observe the old law to be a good Christian? Is he still bound by the Mosaic law? Paul will be dealing with that issue the rest of his career and argue quite sternly that no, they don't. Although, after these events in chapter 16, when Paul takes Timothy with him, he circumcises him because he is a Jew and he hasn't been circumcised yet. I know I've taken a lot of your time. Next time we're going to talk about the separation between Paul and Barnabas and what's happened with Barnabas subsequently. Thank you for joining me for what is now nearly 10 good minutes with the Word.